Thank you, Elias, and good morning, everyone. My name is John Concato, and I'll start this session. The objectives of our combined presentations are to introduce the concept of real-world evidence and discuss related FDA initiatives, describe examples of RWE used in regulatory decision-making, and consider the future direction of RWE involving FDA. My presentation will focus on RWE from the perspective of the Center for Drugs and also the Center for Biologics. I'll first mention that evidence can be perceived in various ways as shown in this cartoon. The title is Today's Random Medical News from the New England Journal of Panic-Inducing Gobbledygook. And it says, according to a report released today, spin the wheel, coffee can cause depression in twins. For real-world evidence and with the focus on drugs and biologics as mentioned, my goals are to provide an overview of FDA's real-world evidence program, describe the concepts of fit-for-use data and adequate study design, and also discuss considerations when using real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making. The first topic is an overview of FDA's real-world evidence program. I'll remind everyone that FDA has expectations in law based on the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016. That act mandates that FDA shall establish a program to evaluate the potential use of RWE to support approval of a new indication for an already approved drug or to satisfy post-approval study requirements. An ongoing program at FDA is based on our 2018 framework that I'll be discussing in more detail. That document describes priority areas, challenges, and potential pilot opportunities that the program can address. Also, FDA should issue draft guidance by December 2021. And of note, the standard for substantial evidence remains unchanged, and the RWE program and our PDUFA commitments are aligned. Although definitions in this space can vary, here are definitions from the FDA framework. Real-world data are data relating to patient health status and/or the delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of sources, and real-world evidence is clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risk of a medical product derived from analysis of real-world data. So to emphasize, real-world evidence is defined by the analysis of real-world data, not by a type of study design per se. The 2018 framework applies to the Center for Drugs and Center for Biologics, as I mentioned, and Dr. Kalb will discuss real-world evidence for the Center for Devices later. As an overview, the document describes FDA's multifaceted program to implement real-world evidence, including internal agency processes, external stakeholder engagement, demonstration projects, and guidance development. A major take-home message from the framework is shown on this slide. 3 important considerations when planning, conducting, or evaluating RWE are first, whether the RWD are fit for use. Second, whether the trial or study design used to generate that evidence can provide adequate scientific evidence to answer or help answer the regulatory question. And third, whether the study conduct meets FDA regulatory requirements. To emphasize these considerations, I'll come back to this slide several times again later. First, though, as another part of a general overview, it's worth noting that FDA has been using what we now call RWE for some time. When evidence informs effectiveness by being fit for purpose, approvals happen. This slide starts in 2010 and shows examples including a particular drug in 2014, blinatumomab. Let's look at that drug and that approval in more detail. We see that the medical product is a bispecific T-cell engager antibody. It was approved in December 2014 for a particular context involving acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And the drug was studied in a single-arm trial where the primary outcome of complete remission or partial hematologic recovery was seen in 43% of participants with a 95% confidence interval as shown. To generate real-world evidence, as shown in the last bullet, these results were then compared to historical data extracted from Europe and the United States with the weighted analysis and propensity score methods used to balance the compared populations. The finding was a complete remission of 24% with a confidence interval as shown, So based on the contrast of the 43 and the 24%, a totality of evidence judgment was made that the drug was effective. We'll return to this study later to see how it fits into the overall RWE landscape, but this gives a little window into one drug in particular. Additional RWE approvals for drugs are shown here, and it actually gives me a chance to say that it's not just drugs, but in terms of biologics, CBER's approval of a zoster vaccine is shown from 2018 based on an observational cohort analysis of electronic health record data. So with that overview, let's turn our attention to describing the concepts of fit-for-use data and adequate study design in particular. Going back to the three considerations, let's start with data. And the specific consideration again is whether the RWD are fit for use. And this also gives me a chance to mention that RWD sources include claims data, electronic health records, registries, device-generated data, and patient-generated data. If we focus on electronic health record data, here are several factors affecting reliability and relevance. For example, selected measurements such as labs, pathology, or imaging studies are used in both clinical practice and in research, sometimes as endpoints. So corresponding challenges are curation of unstructured data and potential inconsistent data format. Second, the timing of assessments in clinical practice may and are often variable, and given that that frequency can vary, patients who show up for follow-up are often different from those who don't. In addition, clinical outcome measures for disease progression may not be used or may not be consistently recorded in practice. So how can gaps and inconsistencies be addressed? And finally, as a technical issue, interoperability will be necessary for studies outside of small populations in one location. And what about linkage to claims across healthcare systems for longitudinal data? I'll highlight examples from the first and last categories on the next few slides to provide some detail. Regarding unstructured data, this example from oncology shows structured data in the left column, with the right column adding unstructured data from text fields in the medical record. Moving down the rows takes us from all lung cancer patients to non-small cell lung cancer patients to those with advanced disease. If an analysis is seeking patients diagnosed after 2013, the structured-only data with 3,500 patients may not be fit for use, whereas the 8,300 study population could be appropriate. This second example focuses on FHIR, or Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, to emphasize that for real-world data to be accessible, we need interoperability across healthcare systems, as I'd mentioned. In brief, Health Level 7 is an international standards organization, and FHIR represents standards describing data formats and elements, as well as application programming interfaces to promote data access. Among the challenges remaining to be addressed are how can problems involving standards be solved, how can technical hurdles be addressed, and also what incentives might advance progress. The bottom line is that more work needs to be done in this technical domain. Let's turn our attention next to study design, and the framework consideration is whether the trial or study design used to generate real-world evidence can provide adequate scientific evidence to answer or help answer the regulatory question. Let's back up to a big picture view for a moment and talk about conceptual terms. Here we see that we could be generating evidence from descriptive studies such as case series or analytic studies focusing on cause-effect associations. Most often, analytic studies are classified as observational if the intervention of interest is given during clinical care, or experimental if assigned by a protocol, which in our line of work is most often a randomized trial. Contemporary terms appear on this slide showing a spectrum of study designs with randomized studies on the left and non-randomized, non-interventional studies on the right. Time doesn't allow a full discussion of this figure, but in general, there's an increasing reliance on real-world data when moving from left to right. Another point is that CDER and CBER are seeing an increase in applications involving trials in clinical practice settings, as well as observational studies. I'll also point out that the blinatumomab approval discussed earlier would be located in the third circle from the left, specifically a single-arm study with an external control as an example of real-world evidence. Another perspective on study design involves hierarchies of design types, which are a staple of health professionals' education with meta-analysis as the strongest evidence, etc., as shown. I'm here mainly to say that life in our profession is a bit more complex. For example, when the Cochrane collaboration compared healthcare outcomes assessed with observational study designs compared with those assessed in randomized trials, they found, on average, there is little evidence for significant effect estimate differences between observational studies and RCTs. So factors other than study design per se need to be considered when exploring reasons for a lack of agreement between the results of RCTs and observational studies. As a specific example, when observational studies are analyzed like randomized experiments, results tend to converge. In fact, the topic of postmenopausal hormone therapy in coronary heart disease is often used to criticize observational studies, but this particular report found that the discrepancies between the randomized women's health initiative and the observational nurses' health study could be largely explained by differences in the distribution of time since menopause and length of follow-up, not by study design. More recent work emphasizes a similar theme. Comparing apples with apples is important when considering study design. Specifically, when comparing effect estimates from RCTs and observational studies, or when thinking about designing an observational study, we should harmonize design features, including eligibility criteria, treatment strategies, and other aspects as shown. We should use similar strategies for data analysis to estimate the causal effect. And for observational studies, we should also conduct sensitivity analyses to investigate the impact of relevant factors. I'll also mention this type of approach is also known as target trial emulation, by the way. The third topic of this presentation involves considerations when using RWE in regulatory decision-making, and the question is whether the study conduct meets FDA regulatory requirements. Well, one core requirement is the need for transparency. Unlike a trial, which is done once when collecting data, multiple analyses are often possible when using real-world data. So good practices for real-world data studies of treatment and/or comparative effectiveness from the official societies shown here, therefore appropriately recommend transparency about study design and analysis before execution for ensuring confidence in results. As a separate topic, and to provide regulatory insights, the FDA framework also describes ongoing demonstration projects for real-world evidence, 3 of which are shown here. For example, the Harmony Outcomes Ancillary Study looks at whether EHRs are suitable for trial recruitment, baseline assessment, and endpoint ascertainment. The Impact AFib study is a proof of concept for conducting randomized trials using FDA's Sentinel database infrastructure. And an RCT duplicate, longitudinal insurance claims are being used in observational cohort analyses to emulate randomized controlled trials on the same topic, thereby pressure testing how observational analyses perform. I'll have time to describe the approach of RCT duplicate in a little bit more detail on the next 2 slides. First, we see that there's an aspect of agreement metrics to be considered. Regulatory agreement in this context was defined as to what extent would RWE replication have led to the same conclusion as the RCT regarding statistical significance. And estimate agreement involves, does the RWE treatment effect lie within the confidence interval of the true effect if defined by the evidence from the randomized trial? I'll note that even with unbiased RWE replications, by chance alone, we would expect some of the replications to not match the clinical trials. This slide shows conceptual hypothetical results, not actual results, but point estimates are on the x-axis, and on the left-hand side, if superiority trials are compared, the scenarios are shown for when regulatory and estimate results agree or disagree for all the permutations. So, for example, the first row shows statistically significant and overlapping results for both the RCT and the RWD-RWE. In the second row on the left, both results are significant, but the point estimate for the RWE study is not within the confidence of the trial, so it therefore disagrees by the estimate agreement, and so on. A corresponding schema is shown on the right for non-inferiority trials. in this case based on a non-inferiority margin, but it's the same conceptual approach. Okay, returning to our regulatory requirements, ultimately RWE studies have to meet regulatory criteria as in 21 Code of Federal Regulations 314.126. I won't read all of these elements, but for example, in the current context, adequate measures must be taken to minimize bias on the part of subjects, observers, and analysts of the data, and this of course represents a distinct challenge for observational studies. The criteria for adequate and well-controlled investigations continue on this slide, including the second bullet saying the method of assigning patients to treatment and control groups should minimize bias to assure comparability of the groups with respect to pertinent variables. Ordinarily, this assignment is done by randomization, but not so, of course, in many examples of RWE. The main point here is that the evidence bar is set high and is not lowered by the 21st Century Cures Act. Okay, we're almost done, so here's a knowledge check from earlier in the presentation. True or false, randomized trials are not within the scope of real-world data and real-world evidence. The answer is false. Randomized trials can involve real-world data, and if so, they are considered real-world evidence. So I'll summarize again for CBER and CDER as take-home points that FDA's real-world evidence program is advancing as outlined in the agency's 2018 real-world evidence framework, that ongoing efforts can identify attributes that promote generation of reliable and relevant real-world data as well as valid real-world evidence, and that alternative study designs can support and augment but are not intended to replace clinical trials for regulatory decision-making. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the people shown on this slide, including Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Karai, Director of the Office of Medical Policy. And with that, I'll now pass the baton to Dr. Soma Kalb from FDA's Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Concato. My name is Soma Kalb, and I'll now continue our plenary session with the perspective of real-world evidence for medical devices. I'll start off describing where real-world evidence fits within our vision at CDRH, then discuss its use in regulatory decision-making, and end with our role in the wider stakeholder community. In 2012, CDRH adopted a new vision statement, and it has guided our center in our activities since then. An increased emphasis and use of real-world evidence is an integral part of achieving this vision. Our vision is that patients in the U.S. have access to high-quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. In order to bring these devices to market, often clinical evidence is needed, and ensuring their continued safety and performance also relies on learning from available clinical information. There are unique considerations for clinical evaluation of medical devices due to inherent differences between devices and drugs. First of all, for many devices, there is a component that relates to the user. Safe and effective use depends on clinician knowledge, experience, and skill. Also, devices are often visualizable, so the devices themselves, as well as the techniques for their use, can be iterated rapidly. Due to the rapid iteration, we need to be able to evaluate devices as efficiently as possible without necessarily requiring a full new prospective trial for every iteration. For many devices, practical limitations require alternative approaches to conducting large randomized controlled studies, and there's flexibility in trial design and statistical analyses that are used. For example, it might not be ethical or practical to use a sham control in a study, so a study might be single arm with a performance goal. Due to these types of differences, clinical studies for devices are often smaller and often leverage other data sources such as modeling or registry data. The need for this flexibility is built into our regulations. In describing what we might consider as valid scientific evidence for marketing, our regulations consider many different types of studies and data as supportive. And so we've been well situated to accept real-world evidence for many years. In trying to reach our vision of bringing safe and effective medical devices to U.S. patients first in the world, our strategic priorities have been aimed at reducing both the time and cost needed to bring devices to market and assure their continued safety and performance. Many of our specific priorities have served as important guideposts on our journey towards increased use of real-world evidence. In 2014 and 2015, we aimed to streamline the pre-market process by reducing the time for FDA approval of clinical trials and examining when it's appropriate to shift data collection from pre-market to post-market. Now, our ability to rely on post-market data collection to support product approvals requires an infrastructure to support collection of data from devices on the market, or real-world data. Our 2016-2017 priorities included establishing a national evaluation system for medical devices, which we now refer to as NEST. NEST will link and synthesize data from different sources across the medical device landscape, including registries, electronic health records, and medical billing claims. But FDA is only one part of the medical device ecosystem. One of our 2018-2020 priorities recognizes that we can achieve our vision most effectively when we work together with other key stakeholders to achieve shared outcomes and solve problems. This priority is referred to as collaborative communities, and the NEST Coordinating Center is one of those. This collaborative community is a national network intended to help develop methodologies around real-world data collection and analysis to meet the needs of patients, payers, the medical device industry, healthcare professionals, and regulatory bodies such as CDRH. And all of our priorities are aimed at reducing the time and cost of clinical evidence generation by taking a total product lifecycle or TPLC approach, where we use flexible, patient-centered benefit-risk paradigms. We collaborate more with customers. We streamline processes, and we apply least burdensome principles. Ensuring that we leverage and learn from the vast amount of data that is routinely collected as a part of healthcare is an important part of our TPLC approach. One example of this is in the transcatheter heart valve area. Nearly a decade ago, the first transcatheter aortic heart valve was approved in the U.S. These heart valves revolutionized treatment for patients with aortic stenosis who were too sick for surgery. While it was a great advancement, the U.S. was the 42nd country to approve this device. At the time of approval, the Transcatheter Valve Therapy, or TVT registry, was established by the Society of Thoracic Surgeons and the American College of Cardiology to monitor patient safety and real-world outcomes related to valve replacement and repair procedures. CMS issued a national coverage decision around this time for these devices, which included a component as a requirement for coverage for data collection in a registry. Subsequent indications have been supported with data from the TVT registry, and in 2017, FDA was the first in the world to approve an iteration of the device, the Edwards Sapien 3, to treat high-risk patients whose bioprosthetic valves were old and worn out. FDA relied on real-world evidence from approximately 600 patients whose data was entered into the TVT registry for what were then off-label valve-in-valve uses. In this case, real-world evidence in the form of registry data allowed approval of a new indication without the need for a standalone prospective clinical trial. Now I'll talk more about the use of real-world evidence for regulatory purposes. There is so much available data that can be leveraged. As Dr. Concato noted, real-world data sources can include diagnostic lab and imaging data, data from device and patient registries, device-generated data from smartphones and wearables, patient-reported outcomes, medical records, and medical billing claims data. And there are many potential uses for real-world evidence across the total product lifecycle. Data from real-world evidence can be hypothesis generating for evaluation in a future prospective clinical study. It can inform prospective trial design or be used as a control arm for a clinical trial. Real-world evidence infrastructure can serve as a framework for data collection for both pre- and post-market clinical studies. It can be used to identify safety signals for medical devices. And as I described for the transcatheter heart valves, evidence from post-market uses can support expansion of indications. I've already provided one example of the potential time and cost reduction that real-world evidence might allow. There are several other benefits as well. As I mentioned before, often device clinical trials are small and generally reflect use under controlled circumstances. Real-world data can provide a better understanding of device performance in the real-world setting, which can further inform the benefit-risk profile of a device. It can allow collection of outcomes that aren't always feasible in traditional trials, such as performance in diverse patient populations and subgroups, long-term outcomes, the ability to assess rarer outcomes as a result of tapping into larger data sets. It provides opportunities to partner with patients in new ways. For example, patient-reported outcomes, mobile medical apps, and wearable devices. It can help inform future device modification and technology development. And it can better help align evidence generation with the rapid innovation cycles that occur with devices. To support and promote the use of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, CDRH issued a guidance in 2017 describing potential uses of various real-world data sources and outlining the criteria for evaluating whether a given real-world data source is fit for regulatory purposes. The guidance describes how we evaluate both the relevance and reliability of potential data sources for various regulatory purposes in the total product lifecycle. And it also outlines how patient protections are an important aspect of our use of real-world evidence. CDRH is supporting and advancing real-world evidence through our Total Product Lifecycle, or TPLC, reviews. Since 2015, we've granted marketing authorization for more than 65 new or modified devices using real-world evidence. CDRH believes so much in total product lifecycle assessment and real-world evidence that we underwent a reorganization to support this approach. One of the offices created in this reorganization is the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis that has expertise in many aspects of clinical evidence generation, such as those shown on this slide. We are leveraging real-world data in post-market areas, such as for post-approval studies, and also we are looking at ways to use real-world data to advance active surveillance. One example of the use of real-world evidence for post-market purposes is referred to as EP PASSION. Development of this paradigm is a multi-stakeholder effort designed to leverage real-world evidence to address post-approval study requirements for leads for implantable cardioverter defibrillators. The leads are the wires that connect the heart to the device, or the device to the heart. A traditional post-approval study involves new enrollment of patients, similar to a clinical trial, where the data are gathered through direct follow-up of patients. These studies contend with challenges in enrollment, losses to follow-up, and often, by the time the study is completed, the next generation device is already on the market. With the real-world evidence paradigm, sponsors aim to leverage real-world data collected during routine clinical care to address the post-market requirements. The collaborators have evaluated multiple data sources to see how they could be linked to yield the data needed to answer the post-market questions. These sources include manufacturer databases such as complaint handling and device registration, administrative claims databases, the National Death Index, and device data that is generated by the ICD itself and accessible through remote monitoring systems. Some sponsors have already demonstrated proof of concept using the ongoing traditional post-approval studies for validation, and they've transitioned to the new EP PASSION real-world evidence approach, which yields more timely and efficient answers to post-market questions, potentially reducing overall study duration by 2 years. The real-world evidence approach has a faster startup time, no losses to follow-up, and is available for the life of the device. In addition, it yields millions of dollars in cost savings. And importantly, it can allow earlier detection of signals with larger sample sizes and the ongoing updates. This effort is a great example of the promise of real-world evidence. Let's pause for a knowledge check. True or false? CDRH cannot accept real-world evidence as the primary support for a marketing application. Correct. The answer is false. As I previously noted, valid scientific evidence can come in many forms to support a marketing application, including real-world evidence. So none of our efforts in real-world evidence are being done in isolation. The medical device ecosystem is very engaged in advancing real-world evidence, and CDRH is at the table for these important advances. CDRH is involved in infrastructure and network development so that the vast amount of data generated in clinical care can be harnessed and linked to address important questions. We are also developing policies and best practices in areas such as data quality and methodologies and analytics, so we know we can rely on the data that are generated. And we're working on these across clinical and device areas and along with other groups such as Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, AdvaMed, CDER, and the NEST Coordinating Center. I'd like to focus a bit on the NEST Coordinating Center. The concept of a national evaluation system originated back in 2012, and it became one of our strategic priorities in 2016 with the selection of MDIC as the NEST Coordinating Center, or NEST-CC, in that year. Just last September, FDA announced our participation in the NEST-CC collaborative community to work together with the multi-stakeholder community to help develop methodologies and increase the value and use of real-world evidence to meet the needs of all stakeholders. NEST-CC has a strong and growing network of collaborators, enabling access to a wide swath of evidence from clinical experience that can be harnessed to support regulatory submissions as well as serve other purposes. The network's institutions have access to robust data organized into standardized common data models. In 2018, the initial data network was formed, and the first series of test cases were selected for funding, with a second set selected in 2019. These test cases explore the network's ability to capture the data needed to support a range of studies and analyses across the device TPLC, using a variety of data sources, as shown on this slide. With the learnings gleaned from the test cases, NEST now has the capacity to intake external projects. NEST 1.0 launched on June 30th of this year, offering services for contracting, project management, research methods, data quality and management, and consultation. In the area of policies and best practices, NEST-CC also has released 2 framework documents that serve as guides for stakeholders collaborating with NEST-CC to ensure that real-world data can be relied upon for regulatory and other purposes. And these frameworks are intended to be updated in the future based on lessons learned and key findings from the test cases. Another key area for NEST-CC since 2018 is active surveillance. We want to leverage real-world evidence to transform medical device surveillance from passive to active, where we continuously generate, access, and evaluate large data sets on device performance and clinical outcomes associated with devices used in routine clinical practice. Work on infrastructure and methods are ongoing for active surveillance. The FDA guidance and the NEST-CC frameworks represent a good starting point for the community to use for real-world evidence in decision-making, and these are works in progress. Future work can provide more clarity around how to assess or characterize the potential fit for purpose of different data sources for specific questions. Further, a roadmap covering how the active surveillance capabilities will be established is currently under development and will be issued for public comment in the near future. I'd also like to note that CDRH is working on a publication highlighting success stories of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making to provide more examples for the stakeholder community and further illuminate the pathway for the use of real-world evidence. So in summary, for the CDRH perspective, clinical evidence for devices comes in many forms across the total product lifecycle, including real-world evidence. Supporting evidence generation with relevant and reliable real-world evidence can help us achieve our vision of timely access to safe and effective medical devices. And high-quality real-world data sources are strategically positioned to further enhance the care of patients and device safety and effectiveness within a collaborative NEST model. So Dr. Concato and I have introduced the concept of harnessing the clinical data that is generated through routine clinical care for a variety of regulatory purposes. We've described how we consider that evidence in our decision-making. FDA is an integral part of this quickly advancing and growing field and is continuing to work in the community to explore ways to optimize the utility of real-world evidence. We look forward to continued discussions through our stakeholder collaborations and in meetings with sponsors. This screen also includes program mailboxes for both CDER and CDRH. As we all work towards that ideal learning healthcare system, I encourage you to become familiar with FDA's real-world evidence activities. Understand concepts of fit-for-use data, relevance and reliability, and appropriate study design, and recognize opportunities for real-world data and real-world evidence to support medical product development. Thank you for your attention to this REdI plenary session. We hope we've given you a better understanding of how FDA incorporates real-world evidence into our contemporary regulatory framework. I hope you enjoy the rest of the program.